Section 19. The Fist Clenches. Strongholds of the Sons of Dorn.
Dig in. Do not yield. Never yield. Close the fist.
Last words bellowed by Chapter Master Lestrades as he battled the demon tide on Terra. When the Emperor fell, and the Custodes abandoned Terra for reasons unknown, the garrison of Imperial Fists led the desperate counterattack against demons, which poured forth from the shattered Golden Throne. Their disciplined gun lines and defensive formations carefully and calmly pumped bolter shell after bolter shell into the onrushing horde, as they led the Arbites and Terran Imperial Guard on a last, doomed charge on the Imperial Palace. The vast galleries and corridors within the palace ran fluid with demon essence, and they were assailed at every turn by gibbering clerks and adepts driven wild with fright or corruption. These were gunned down all the same as the Imperial Fist contingent pushed onwards. The throne had connected into the deep warp, and as they neared the throne room, older, fouler demons spilled into reality. Demons that had never been manifest before. Tendrils and coiling, maddening shapes forced themselves through the very fabric of the air, tearing Marines from their feet to their dooms, or boiling guardsmen where they stood. However, the Astartes never faltered, never floundered, but pushed onwards, swinging twin thunderhammers with furious abandon. Their Primarch had built the palace defenses, and they made it difficult for the Imperial Fists to enter the palace. Ironically, the Fists had made a fortress so well, even they couldn't get through properly. This desperate battle, however, was never about victory. The Fists had succeeded in their objective. They had bought the people of Terra a few precious hours, allowing scores of vessels to flee the doomed homeworld. Among the fleeing humans, a single Imperial Fist neophyte went as well. As the Imperial Fists fell to the nightmares pouring straight from hell, the neophyte carried a message from his master. A final order that would change the history of the Astartes of Dorn for the next 10,000 years. He told this neophyte to travel across the galaxy, to everywhere a Fist, or Iron Lord, or other Marines of Dorn were fighting, and to tell them to dig in, to fortify. He did so, and soon his message was taken up by other Imperial Fists stationed off-world and other forces across the galaxy. Across the Imperium, even as it began to shatter, the Imperial Fists and their successors made good on their orders. Fleets diverted themselves to the nearest defensible planets, or stayed put upon planets recently taken back from heretics and rebels. Here, they began to fortify each of these worlds. In some cases, Templar chapter houses already existed, and the Black Templars stationed there welcomed their founding chapter brethren with open arms. In other cases, the Imperial Fists had to find the central palace of a world and demand to fortify it. Dorn's Astartes began to increase orbital defenses, helped worlds found weapon factories and build bunkers, and toughened the structures of buildings currently standing upon the worlds. Any Imperial naval vessels or Fist ships damaged beyond repair were stripped down, their guns and ammunition stockpiles were cannibalized, and great orbital guns were built into the surface of these growing Imperial Fist fortress worlds. The gutted hulks of these vessels were converted into space stations, stocking additional fighter craft and bombers in the event they would be required. Supply lines and logistical support were installed and made incredibly efficient by the Allied Fist chapters. Food was secured to feed the populace of these worlds, either from the agricultural areas of worlds by securing off-world agri-facilities, or creating underground artificial ecosystems deep beneath the layers of armor and steel which began to cover these worlds. Every building was converted into potential defensive structures, with angled geometry to allow overlapping arcs of fire and maximum avenues of assault. Killing zones were subtly crafted, disguised as town squares or ditches. Bunkers and trench systems were rapidly installed, and rationing was put into immediate effect. In most cases, these measures were welcomed by the native populace, who were utterly terrified by the loss of contact with the wider Imperium, and the near-constant Xenos and chaotic attacks and raids. With the Imperial Fists there to help defend, they felt their confidence bolster, and aided their superhuman allies in any way they could. Ranks of the PDF increased by an average of 60% on many of these worlds, with the reserve PDF forces and militias composed of more than half of the entire world population of many of these worlds in question. The most famous and effective of these fortress worlds was New Marsis. New Marsis was an embattled Imperial world even by early Millennium 42. besieged as it was by Helicore Ravagers, a bizarre species of metal-fanged Xenos monsters. Captain Hun of the Imperial Fist's 4th Company led a strike force of Imperial Fists against these aliens and drove them off. As a happy coincidence, a Templar's chapter house was located upon the surface and had aided in the defeat of the foe. The two forces of Marines met up with each other, swapping stories as they performed the strange, masochistic rituals of the Dorn successors. When the Astronomicon went out, and warp storms began to buckle and flare across the entire galaxy, killing almost all astropaths, the Space Marines found themselves stranded. Unlike other Space Marines, they didn't tear off to assault the nearest foe. The Templars amongst them wished to, but the Imperial Fists persuaded them to stay put for the time being. Eventually, word came via sporadic reinforcement from injured or lost Imperial Fist chapter serfs that their orders were to dig in anyway, and thus, Hun threw himself wholeheartedly into fortifying the planet. Like the other Fists, as mentioned above, he crafted efficient and effective orbital defenses and built up the orbital batteries. He placed his fleet and the system's own defense fleet on constant patrol around the system boundaries, always within Vox contact of New Marsis. The governor of Marsis was happy to help the Astartes. With his government's cooperation, soon every city became a fortress, and the people, eager to help, took up arms and militia roles. The small strike force's tech marines set to work, guiding the industrial sector of the planet to increase production of arms, armor, and munitions, in addition to their usual output. Hun also instructed several factories how to produce bolter shells, discreetly remembering not to tell them how to produce holy bolters, for they were for the Astartes alone. The PDF of the planet, the Falcina, were built up and extensively drilled by their superhuman allies. They wielded lasguns and carbines in addition to their traditional billhook weapons. And with the new training and equipment, the Falcina billmen were a force to be reckoned with. The 50 Marine Imperial Fist Force, in addition, made the decision to split up into smaller units. Each Marine took command of several squads of Falcina or took command of artillery divisions or armor squadrons, and hence disseminated their massive siege experience to the masses. While the Arbite's Precinct, the Governor's Palace, and Templar Chapter Fortress were all void-shielded from orbital assault, most of the population centers and cities were not. Hun, scavenging the generators from several of the most damaged and irreparable ships, converted these starship shields into city-wide force fields, which were installed on almost every city, much to the gratitude of the human populace. The 30 Black Templars left upon the world remained slightly aloof from the humans, and maintained their squad formations. However, they did submit to Hun's overall leadership, and their 1,000-strong force of chapter serfs were still highly trained and well-equipped to defend their keep. Thus, New Marsis was fortified, and just like all the other Fist strongholds, it was to be tested very soon after. The petty Imperium of Aton was ruled by Aton, a vain and foolish man. Unfortunately, his vanity allowed him to become possessed by a demon of Slanesh. His entire Imperium was soon taken over, and the worship of dark gods began in the Atonian Imperium. The demon Aton decided that, in order to christen his new empire of 60 worlds, he would baptize it in blood. The blood of New Marsis, to be precise. His fleets penetrated the outer system in 222 Millennium 43. For weeks, Hun's Imperial Fist fleet harassed and harried the post-Imperial fleet as it traveled towards New Marsis, damaging and crippling dozens of Aton's cargo and supply ships before fleeting back into the outer system. Aton's main battle fleet consisted of a single battleship, over 8 cruisers, and many escorts. By the time he reached New Marsis, he had 6 cruisers and much fewer escorts, not to mention fewer logistical vessels. Nevertheless, Aton's dread force was still massive. This sizable fleet smashed into the densely packed orbital stations and defenses erected in orbit. Hollowed-out wrecks formed crude carrier vessels, unleashing hundreds upon hundreds of fighters, bombers, and Thunderhawks at the enemy force as monitor vessels opened up upon the fleet, as well as the already in place laser orbital and the long-range torpedo silos built into the planet itself. Another cruiser was blasted apart, as well as 2 more escorts. Still, he managed to get his battleship in orbital strike range, and fired. Flames, brimstone, and searing shafts of light rained down upon the entire world, lighting up the sky an angry orange and red as it churned the clouds and rumbled off the numerous city force fields across the world. The sound was deafening, but the people of New Marsis, inspired by the Marine benefactors, showed no fear. It was said that, as the skies filled with fire, Sergeant Blant of Squad 6 of the Strike Force stood in the middle of the capital's town square and began to laugh loudly, his thunderous voice carrying to all the people of the city who cowered. He then took up some scraps of metal and began to beat a tune out upon with the pommel of his broadsword, singing a hearty war song as he did so. Eventually, other people began to pile into the streets and sing along in defiance. The bombardments lasted for 3 days. In that time, only one shield failed. The unfortunate city of Shogar was blasted into fiery ruins within a few minutes. The lives of over 7 million people snuffed out as if nothing. But the defense lasers reaped a terrible toll amongst the orbiting fleet. The rest of New Marsis was unbowed. As soon as possible, Aton sent his massive numbers of troop ships to land upon the surface. The enemy landed with almost no losses as they landed upon the ruins of Shogar, where there was no longer anything to stop them. Aton's army was vast, numbering almost 60 million troopers, with attendant armor and chimera transports. Great banners unfurled, bearing the cursed ruins of Slanesh crudely painted over the Aquila. Demonettes groped and convorted amongst the ranks of Atonian troopers as the giant nude form of Aton sat upon a giant void-shielded dais in all his androgynous evil majesty. The army headed with all speed towards the capital, Sherivar. If Aton could break the center of Imperial Fist power, the planet would be his. Artillery rained fire and explosives upon the city for 2 full days before the army charged the fortress. Las cannons flared and speared across avenues, bolters fired and autoguns barked as weapons discharged in crisscrossing confusing arcs. Tanks rumbled through the streets, only to be blown apart by concealed missile teams who were in turn burnt out by hellhounds or killed by heavy cannons destroying their buildings. Imperial fists were present at every gun line, barking orders which had been drilled into every human on the planet for years, the concentrated and disciplined firepower driving back wave after murderous wave of soldiers. Armored battalions clashed in the narrow avenues and wider parks, exchanging devastating barrages of high explosive ammunition. The 30 Templars were out in the action, every single one wearing a jump pack. Like angels of doom, they darted from killzone to killzone, striking viciously and swiftly, wherever ordered by Hun. Their fists, hammers, picks, axes, and whirring chain blades cut bloody swaths through the twisted ranks of the fallen post-imperial troopers. The trenches throughout the city were bloody killing grounds where troopers and feral things tussled in the blood and gristle of already dead soldiers. It was work for knives, clubs, heavy blades, and shotguns as the enemy were joined in epic conflict. Hun traveled in his Land Raider, storming off to every battle he could find across the city, charging from the bowels of his chariot vehicle and ripping apart foes with his lightning claws, as his Terminator assault squad smashed apart the foes with hammers and great tower shields. The Falsina fought bravely and fiercely, their billhooks bloody with the terrible toll they reaped amongst their traitorous foes. The barely armed militia fought at their shoulders, aiding the billmen as the enemy sought to surround them. All had curses upon their lips and faith in their beleaguered hearts. The chapter house was a blazing charnel house, as the servitor-controlled bipod las and autocannons fired almost constantly, while defiant Black Templar serfs manned the walls and windows of the fortress, pouring bolter and las rounds into the braying, crazed hordes. It was said that as the gate was battered down and the enemy threatened to storm the building, the senior chapter serf, fearful of failing his superhuman masters, took up one of the marine power swords and ran to defend the gate. Though the blade was a mere short sword to a marine, he wielded it like some great double-handed barbarian sword, howling Templar oaths as he cut down his foes. Though only a serf, the senior serf was modified and strong, trained to the peak level of mortal human strength and speed, and he smote his foes terrible blows. For hours upon hours, he held the gates. Sergeant Blant walked around the city in a defiant state of good cheer. His insane joy at battle was the stuff of legends. He was said to have been juggling swords and blades as he sang at the top of his lungs to be heard over the din of battle. As he cackled with laughter, lopping off limbs and heads with dismissive blows of his broadsword. At one point, he was said to have even been playing his Ulian pipes in one hand, while he fired his bolter from the hip in the other hand. The battle was bloody and brutal, and lasted for a full week. The siege was finally broken as Hun's fleet returned and assaulted the Auton Devil's fleet. Caught between the orbital defenses and this new fleet, the Autonian fleet had to flee into the warp, leaving Auton on world. Eventually, his forces were forced from the capital and hounded until they reached Shogar, from whence they came. For the second time, orbital bombardment fell upon the ruins, and Auton's army was no more. Hun and his marines remained on the planet for the rest of the period, ever fortifying and reinforcing the defenses of the planet, fighting off alien tyrants and devilish monsters nearly every year. These wars were fierce, murderous, and terrible, and soon the good cheer of the defenders became somber, dour determination and grit. The story was similar across all the Imperial Fist strongholds. As they closed their fists, the Imperial Fists hardened their hearts and sealed themselves from the galaxy, fighting anyone who even entered their systems, until the galaxy abandoned them entirely. The galaxy shattered, and the Age of Strife flared into horrific life, and all the while, the bitter, hard-nosed fists of Dorn just dug in deeper and deeper. Bloodied, battered, muddy, but unbowed. These were the fists. Unbowed, but blind and futile in their defenses, for as they suspected, they held out for nothing. No help, no relief would ever come. They would remain, entrenched on their muddy, barbed wire swath fortress worlds forever. Even the mad cheerfulness of Marines like Blant wouldn't change this simple, depressing fact.